Okay, we're looking at different policies that can correct market failure, and in this particular video we're looking at this one here, subsidizing the good. Now, whenever you look at any of these policies, the key thing is that you have to explain what the policy actually does. You can't just say that when we introduce a policy, this will correct the market failure, or that this will lead to an increase in the quantity being traded. That's stating what it does rather than explaining what it does. And so when we come to the subsidies one, here it is, it's going to reduce the price to consumers, but there's a little bit more than that, as we'll see. So what you have to do is you have to explain how it affects the quantity being demanded, that's from the consumption side in the market, or the quantity being supplied, or in fact both. In this case we'll see that it's both. And then once you've done that, and only once you've done that, you can explain how it changes the quantity traded on the x-axis and how it will correct the market failure. And you have to state in your analysis, you get right to the end of the analysis and you say, when we've introduced the subsidy, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, and then we will have corrected the market failure. So let's look at subsidies in a bit more detail. Basically, a subsidy is just given by the government to any firm where they want to increase the production, and they subsidise by giving them a sum of money for every unit that they produce. And in effect that reduces the costs of the firm, because remember the supply curve tells you how much the firms are willing and able to supply at each and every price. In other words, they've taken into account all their costs, and if they get a subsidy, that in effect reduces the costs. So here's an example. Suppose the firm is willing and able to supply at £30 a certain quantity. Okay, then they get a £5 subsidy for every good that is made. Now it makes them willing and able to supply at 25. So they get £25 in the market. They then get £5 subsidy, which makes up the £30. On a supply curve, it would effectively move the supply downwards, vertically downwards, by the amount of the subsidy. So, as from the previous example, they were willing and able to supply at £30, they're now willing and able to supply at £25 because they get that price in the market, then they get a subsidy of £5, meaning they receive in the end their £30. Now, how is this going to affect the market? Well, the first thing that you need to say, it reduces the price in the market from P0 to P1. So we start at an equilibrium point here, and then with the subsidy moving this supply curve down means that we end up at an equilibrium point here, and the first thing to note is there is this lower price. This is the lower price that the consumers will pay in the market, and therefore from the consumption side, always do it from both sides of the market, from the consumption side there is an increase in the quantity demanded. So we're going from this E0 to E1 here. Reduction in price leads to a movement along the demand curve, and so there's an increase in the quantity being demanded. Then what you need to recognize is that although the market price is now lower at this P1, that the subsidy then is given to the firm, which will mean that the price that the firm eventually get is P1 in the market, here we are, plus the subsidy, and so they eventually get P2. And so this point here will give you how much the firm will receive in the market. So overall, what you need to say is the consumer. What happens to the consumer? Consumer pays a lower price, so they move from this point E0 down to E1. They pay a lower price, and that stimulates an increase in quantity demanded along your demand curve. From the firm's point of view, the producer, they start at E0 and they get certainly P1 in the marketplace, but then they get the subsidy, and so the firm will actually receive a higher price, P2, and so they move along their supply curve. Then you can say that the firm will supply this quantity here, the demander, the consumer, will demand this quantity, we're in equilibrium, and therefore as a whole there's an increase in the quantity traded on the axis. Then you would go on to say that that leads to the market failure being corrected. Hope that's clear.